The stone city of Machu Picchu is one of the most fascinating.
I'll write this as a factually grounded script, keeping the engaging tone, but correcting the pseudo-archaeological claims from the reference. Lost civilizations, sound-softened stone, ancient aliens-adjacent theories aren't supported by evidence. Real archaeology has solid answers about how the Inca and their predecessors did this work. Peru's greatest mystery finally solved. Megalithic ruins no human could ever build. High in the Peruvian Andes, at more than 11,000 feet above sea level, sits a wall that has outlasted empires. Stones the size of delivery trucks, some weighing over 100 tons, sit fitted together so tightly that not even a knife blade slides between them. No mortar holds them in place. No cement, no adhesive, nothing but the sheer precision of the cut. For centuries, visitors have stood before Sacsayhuaman, the great stone fortress above Cusco, and asked the same question. How did anyone build this without modern machinery? For just as long, that question has attracted wild answers. Lost civilizations, sound-based stone softening, forgotten super technologies erased by catastrophe. It makes for a great story. But it is not what actually happened. The real story, the one archaeologists, geologists, and engineers have pieced together over decades of fieldwork, is in some ways even more impressive than the myths, because it required no magic at all. It required something rarer: extraordinary organization, generational knowledge, and an intimate understanding of stone that took the Andean world thousands of years to develop. This is the story of how Peru's megalithic walls were actually built, and why the mystery was never really about the impossible. It was about how much we underestimated human ingenuity. To understand Sacsayhuaman, you have to start long before the Inca. The Central Andes were not a blank slate when the Inca Empire rose in the 13th century. People had been living, farming, and building in this region for at least 5,000 years, and stoneworking traditions stretch back nearly as far. Long before Cusco became an imperial capital, cultures like the Wari and the Tiwanaku were already producing sophisticated stone architecture across the highlands. The Tiwanaku, centered near Lake Titicaca, built temple complexes with precisely cut andesite blocks centuries before the Inca existed. This matters because the impossible stonework of the Inca era did not spring from nowhere. It was the culmination of a very long regional tradition of quarrying, shaping, and fitting stone, refined generation after generation by specialists who passed their techniques down through apprenticeship, much the way European guild masons passed down cathedral-building knowledge over centuries. The Inca were not primitive people who suddenly discovered an alien secret. They were the inheritors of one of the oldest continuous stoneworking traditions on Earth. The materials themselves also deserve a second look, because the reference to diamond hardness, stone that supposedly could not be worked with ancient tools, does not hold up well against the actual geology. Sacsayhuaman's walls are built primarily from limestone in the lower courses and andesite in some of the largest blocks, both of which are significantly softer than diamond. Andesite sits around 6 or 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, and limestone is softer still. That is workable stone, especially when you have the right tools, and the Inca did. Stone hammers made of harder rocks like hematite or river cobbles were used to pound and abrade the surface of softer stone, a slow but entirely effective process called pecking. Bronze chisels supplemented this work for finer shaping. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of these hammerstones at Andean quarry sites, some still sitting exactly where masons left them, worn smooth from repeated use. This is not speculation. It is physical evidence, sitting in museum collections and excavation sites across Peru. The quarries themselves tell a similarly grounded story. The stone used at Sacsayhuaman came from nearby outcrops, some within a few kilometers, including the Rumacalca quarry, which supplied volcanic andesite used across multiple Inca sites in the Cusco region. Researchers have traced quarry marks, partially cut blocks left in place, and transport routes connecting these sites to construction locations. In several spots, unfinished stones still show the marks of extraction. Wedge holes where wooden stakes were driven into cracks and then soaked with water, so the wood would swell and split the rock along a controlled line. This technique, called wedging, is documented across ancient stoneworking cultures worldwide, from Egypt to India, and it requires no exotic technology, just patience and an understanding of material behavior. Moving the stones is the part that captures the most imagination, and reasonably so, because dragging a 100-ton block up a mountainside is a genuine engineering feat, but it is a solvable one, and the Spanish chroniclers who arrived in the 16th century actually documented how it was done. Colonial accounts, including those of the Jesuit priest Burnaby Cobo, describe massive labor forces, sometimes numbering in the thousands, using log rollers, earthen ramps, and thick ropes made from woven plant fiber to haul stones across the landscape. The Inca state ran on a labor tax system called the MITA, in which communities across the empire owed rotating service to the state, including construction labor. This gave Inca engineers access to a workforce that most ancient societies could not match. Tens of thousands of people, organized, fed, and directed with a kind of logistical planning that also built over 20,000 miles of road across the empire. Moving a massive stone is far less mysterious when you have the ability to mobilize several thousand people to pull it in coordinated unison, guided by ramps built specifically for that purpose, some of which archaeologists have identified as earthen construction ramps at Ollantaytambo, still partially visible today, leading directly from the quarry across the valley to the construction site. The famous polygonal fitting, where each stone has a unique, irregular shape but locks perfectly with its neighbors, looks like it must have required computer precision measurement. In practice, it reflects a refined trial and error method that stonemasons across history have used when working without mortar. Workers would rough out a stone, place it against its neighbor, and use abrasive sand or a scribing tool to mark exactly where the surfaces did not meet. They would then remove the block, grind down the high points, and test fit it again. This process, repeated many times over days or weeks per block, produces exactly the kind of tight, irregular joint seen at Sacsayhuaman. It is laborious, but it is not mysterious, and modern experimental archaeology has replicated smaller versions of this exact process using only stone and bronze tools, confirming that the technique works. There is also a very practical reason the Inca favored this irregular, interlocking style over neat rectangular blocks, and it is one the reference material actually got partially right: earthquake resistance. Peru sits along a highly active seismic zone, and the region experiences frequent, sometimes severe, earthquakes. Structural engineers who have studied Inca polygonal masonry, including teams from Peruvian and Japanese universities that conducted vibration testing, have found that irregular, multi-sided stones distribute seismic energy more effectively than uniform rectangular blocks, because the many contact points and angled joints allow for tiny amounts of movement and flex without the wall coming apart. This is not accidental mysticism. It is empirical engineering that the Inca almost certainly refined through observation over generations. Buildings that survived earthquakes influenced how the next structures were designed. Spanish colonial buildings, often built with mortar and rigid geometry in the following century, cracked and collapsed in earthquakes that left the older Inca wall standing, which is exactly what you would expect from more flexible, better distributed stonework. No mystery required. The claim that the Inca never took credit for these structures is often stretched into something it was not. Colonial chroniclers did record Inca origin stories describing earlier peoples and mythological ancestors, which is true of almost every culture with an oral tradition that includes creation narratives. But there is also extensive documentation, both from Spanish accounts and from Inca quipu record keepers, describing specific Inca rulers commissioning specific building projects. Sacsayhuaman's major construction phase is attributed in colonial sources to the reign of Pachacuti and continued under his successors, using labor drawn from across the empire, a detail multiple independent chroniclers recorded consistently. The idea that the Inca uniformly denied building their own monuments does not match the historical record nearly as cleanly as it is sometimes presented. Modern technology has indeed transformed how we study these sites, and this part of the story is genuinely exciting without needing embellishment. LiDAR surveys conducted across the Sacred Valley over the past decade have revealed extensive networks of agricultural terraces, roads, and settlement patterns hidden under vegetation, dramatically expanding our understanding of how densely the Inca and their predecessors organized the landscape. These surveys have shown that sites like Machu Picchu were not isolated monuments, but nodes in a much larger, integrated system of terracing, water management, and road infrastructure. The drainage systems at Machu Picchu, often cited as impossibly advanced, reflect careful and well-documented hydraulic engineering. Channels cut to manage the 60-plus inches of annual rainfall the region receives, preventing the kind of erosion that would otherwise destroy a mountaintop settlement within a few decades. Archaeologists have mapped these systems in detail, and they follow logical, traceable engineering principles rather than anything unexplainable. The astronomical alignments at sites like the Coricancha Temple are real and well-studied, and they reflect something worth appreciating on its own terms. The Inca maintained a sophisticated calendar system tied to agricultural cycles, solstice observations, and ceremonial timing, which was essential for coordinating a farming empire spread across wildly different climate zones, from coastal desert to high alpine terrain to Amazonian lowland. Aligning temples to solstice sunrises was a practical and spiritual necessity, not evidence of hidden science. Cultures around the world, from Stonehenge to Chichen Itza to the pyramids of Giza, built solar and stellar alignments into their monumental architecture because tracking the sky was essential to timing planting, harvests, and religious festivals long before mechanical calendars existed. As for the idea that a mysterious plant or sound frequency softened stone, this claim traces back to second-hand folklore reports repeated by early 20th century explorers, most notably Percy Fawcett, who himself never witnessed such a substance and was relaying stories he had heard rather than documented fact. No geological, chemical, or archaeological evidence has ever supported stone softening of andesite or diorite by any known or unknown method, and no residue, tool, or process consistent with such a technique has been found at any Andean site despite extensive excavation. Real geology explains the smooth, tightly fitted surfaces through the abrasive grinding and test fitting process described earlier, a slow mechanical process that produces exactly the visual effect people mistake for melting or molding. It's also worth addressing the radiocarbon dating claims directly, because this is where a lot of misinformation creeps in. Yes, archaeologists have found organic material near some Andean sites that dates back thousands of years, sometimes predating the Inca Empire by a wide margin. This is not surprising and does not imply a hidden advanced civilization. It reflects exactly what mainstream archaeology already documents: continuous human habitation of the Andean highlands for thousands of years before the Inca rose to power, including the Wari, Tiwanaku, Chavin, and other well-documented cultures that built their own stone architecture, developed metallurgy, wove sophisticated textiles, and left substantial archaeological records. Older human presence in the region is not evidence of a mystery. It is evidence of exactly the layered, evolving history that archaeologists have been mapping in careful detail for over a century, using excavation, ceramics, architecture, and yes, radiocarbon dating of organic material, which remains a completely standard and reliable technique when applied correctly to material actually associated with construction layers. None of this makes Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, or Machu Picchu any less remarkable. If anything, understanding the real mechanics behind them makes the achievement more impressive, not less. These were not shortcuts handed down by a vanished super-civilization. They were the product of thousands of years of accumulated stoneworking knowledge, a labor system capable of mobilizing tens of thousands of workers, sophisticated logistics for quarrying and transport, and engineering wisdom refined through generations of trial, failure, and earthquake-tested success. The Inca and the cultures before them accomplished something that still challenges modern engineers to replicate, not because they had lost technology, but because they had something modern construction rarely needs anymore: a civilization-wide, multi-generational investment in a single craft, executed by a workforce whose sole job, sometimes for an entire lifetime, was to master the fitting of stone against stone. There's a reason this real explanation gets overshadowed by wilder theories, and it says more about us than about the ruins. Ancient civilizations are too often assumed to have been simple, unsophisticated, incapable of complex achievement without outside help. That assumption is not just inaccurate, it is a disservice to the extraordinary organizational and technical accomplishments of Andean societies, who built an empire of roads, terraces, temples, and fortresses across some of the most difficult terrain on the planet using nothing but stone tools, human labor, and an astonishing depth of practical knowledge. The mystery of Peru's megalithic ruins was never really about how the impossible happened. It was about how much of human capability we had quietly written off as impossible in the first place. The Inca did not need a lost civilization's secrets. They built their own, one carefully fitted stone at a time, and it has outlasted 500 years of earthquakes to prove it. These surveys have shown that sites like Machu Picchu were not isolated monuments, but nodes in a much larger, integrated system of terracing, water management, and road infrastructure. The drainage systems at Machu Picchu, often cited as impossibly advanced, reflect careful and well-documented hydraulic engineering. Channels cut to manage the 60-plus inches of annual rainfall the region receives, preventing the kind of erosion that would otherwise destroy a mountaintop settlement within a few decades. Archaeologists have mapped these systems in detail, and they follow logical, traceable engineering principles rather than anything unexplainable. The astronomical alignments at sites like the Coricancha Temple are real and well-studied, and they reflect something worth appreciating on its own terms. The Inca maintained a sophisticated calendar system tied to agricultural cycles, solstice observations, and ceremonial timing, which was essential for coordinating a farming empire spread across wildly different climate zones, from coastal desert to high alpine terrain to Amazonian lowland. Aligning temples to solstice sunrises was a practical and spiritual necessity, not evidence of hidden science. Cultures around the world, from Stonehenge to Chichen Itza to the pyramids of Giza, built solar and stellar alignments into their monumental architecture, because tracking the sky was essential to timing planting, harvests, and religious festivals long before mechanical calendars existed. As for the idea that a mysterious plant or sound frequency softened stone, this claim traces back to second-hand folklore reports repeated by early 20th century explorers, most notably Percy Fawcett, who himself never witnessed such a substance and was relaying stories